All right, Dive Computer strapped on. You've handed us this stack of material articles, research, your own notes, all centered around the fascinating, sometimes, well, frustrating world of international organizations.
Yeah.
With a real laser focus on the United Nations, right? And how it's sort of navigated the years since the Soviet Union collapsed.
It's a deep well of information, definitely. Covers everything from, the big principles down to the nitty-gritty of structural debates.
Absolutely. And the central puzzle that just jumps out from these sources, and it's something people argue about constantly, is this. Why do we even have organizations like the UN, especially when, let's be honest, they often get slammed for seeming, well, ineffective? It's that tension, isn't it, between the need we think is there and what we actually see happening or not happening?
It's a crucial question because it really touches on these global challenges that, like it or not, impact everyone.
So our mission in this deep dive, pulling straight from the material you've given us, is to unpack these complexities. We're going to look at why these organizations exist, dig into the persistent calls for reform, figure out what those debates are really about,
Right.
and try to get a handle on the UN's actual role in, the messy, changing world of today.
Sounds good. Ready when you are.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump right into that core tension. You see cartoons in your sources, like the ones from the 2006 Lebanon crisis.
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
Painting the UN as just a talking shop. It's such a common criticism. Lots of speeches, maybe not so much action.
I mean, it's a very visible criticism, yeah. Because the talking, that happens out in the open. But the behind-the-scenes stuff, or maybe the conflicts that don't start because of the UN, that's much harder to see.
Good point. But the sources immediately counter this with some really powerful insider perspectives. There's Dag Hammarskjöld, right, the second UN Secretary General, famously saying the UN wasn't created to bring humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell.
That's a pretty stark reminder of the stakes involved.
Yeah.
And Shashi Tharoor, he references Churchill, puts it maybe more simply, jaw is better than war. The fundamental point in the material, really, is that just having a dedicated place for countries to talk through their differences, however frustrating that talk might seem sometimes, it's still way better than resorting to violence.
So, okay, even if they aren't perfect problem solvers, they serve this vital purpose. According to these sources, there are two big ways international organizations help. First, they provide that space for countries to handle conflict peacefully.
Yeah, a forum.
A forum to discuss the really contentious stuff instead of fighting over it.
And this isn't just about, the big dramatic peace negotiations we see on the news. It's also the day-to-day diplomacy, the quiet stuff that stops minor spats from blowing up. These IOs, they offer established channels and norms for that.
Okay. And the second major function the sources highlight, helping countries cooperate on these massive shared challenges, the kind no single nation can possibly manage alone. Think about, disease eradication, wiping out polio. That needed this huge coordinated global vaccination effort.
Right.
Or global warming, one country cutting emissions isn't going to fix it, is it? You need the major industrial powers somehow finding a way to work together.
And what's fascinating here, and the sources really dig into this, is the gap between recognizing a shared problem, like climate change.
Which most countries do now.
Right, most do. But then actually implementing solutions, that's where it gets incredibly hard. Nations struggle to agree on the how. How do you fairly share the costs, the benefits? And crucially, how do you trust that the other guy will actually stick to the deal? This is where the sources suggest IOs, like the UN, really earn their keep.
How so?
Well, they provide the information, the rules, the monitoring mechanisms, the bureaucratic plumbing, basically, that helps build confidence among members so that cooperation actually becomes possible. Not easy, but possible.
Okay, so why should you, listening right now, care about all this bureaucracy and diplomacy? Because these challenges, climate, disease, global stability, they aren't just abstract political science concepts.
I know.
They land on everyone's doorstep, sometimes literally. How nations manage these shared problems or fail to manage them directly shapes the world we all live in. It affects your well-being.
Precisely. The connections are, undeniable when you look closely.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the big one then, the UN itself. Your sources trace its history, reminding us it wasn't the first attempt at this kind of global body.
No, the League of Nations after World War I tried, but ultimately it failed to prevent World War II.
Which led directly to the UN's founding in 1945. The goal was explicit this time. create something more robust, something that could actually prevent a third world war. Started with 51 states signing the original charter.
Yeah, 51 original members.
And look how it's grown. By 2011, the sources say membership had swelled to 193 states.
Huge expansion.
And the UN's initial and still current broad objectives were kind of threefold: preventing conflict, facilitating cooperation, and promoting social and economic development worldwide.
At its core, the structure involves the General Assembly. That's where every member state gets one vote, theoretically representing sovereign equality.
Theoretically.
But then you've got the real powerhouse, or at least the one with the most formal power, the Security Council.
Ah, yes, the Security Council, the one that really sparks all the debate. It has 5 permanent members, the P5, U.S., Russia, UK, France, and China. Your material points out they were essentially the victors and the most powerful states coming out of World War II. That's how they got there.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And alongside them are 10 non-permanent members. They serve 2-year terms. They're elected to ensure some geographic representation across the globe. And they can't be immediately reelected. Keeps things rotating, in theory.
And the public face, the administrative head, is the Secretary General. The sources tell us the current one, the 9th, is Antonio Guterres. His background includes leading the UN Refugee Agency and being Prime Minister of Portugal before that.
Right. And it's really vital to remember, as the sources emphasize, the UN isn't just the General Assembly and the Security Council in New York. It's this sprawling network of specialized agencies.
Right, like the WHO for Health.
WHO, UNDP for Development, UNICEF for Children, agencies for refugees, human rights, culture. I mean, the list goes on. They're all tackling specific global issues, many far beyond just the peace and security mandates everyone thinks of first.
Okay, so given that this core structure, especially the Security Council, was basically set up in 1945, it makes perfect sense that after the Cold War ended, around 1989, questions about its relevance and effectiveness just exploded.
Absolutely. The world had fundamentally changed. The whole U.S.-Soviet bipolar rivalry, gone. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower. U.S.-Russia relations were completely redefined. China and India were rising dramatically. Asian economies booming.
Plus, decades of decolonization meant scores and scores of new member states had joined the UN. They weren't there in 45.
Exactly. And on top of all that, you had these new global challenges really coming to the forefront. Terrorism, climate change, pandemics. Things that maybe weren't the top priority or even conceived of back then.
So by the early 90s, people were asking, is this 1945 model really equipped for the modern world? Your sources identify 2 main areas where the reform debate really focuses. One, the actual structures and processes of the organization, and that usually means the Security Council.
Yeah.
And 2, the issues or the jurisdiction the UN takes on, like what should it actually be doing?
So pretty much everything about what it is and what it does is up for debate.
And here's where the material really highlights the deadlock, the frustration. While there's, and I'm quoting here, widespread agreement that reform is needed.
Everyone agrees on that part.
Right. But there's little clarity and consensus on how or when it should actually happen. Everyone agrees something must change, but nobody can agree on what change or how to do it.
And that lack of consensus among, 193 member states, each with their own agenda, their own interests.
Yeah.
That's the core reason why reform moves, well, at a glacial pace, if at all.
Okay, let's really dive into that first area then. Reforming the structures, specifically the Security Council, because that's where the most heated arguments seem to flare up.
It's definitely the flashpoint for discussions about power and representation within the UN system.
Way back in 1992, the General Assembly formally voiced 3 main complaints about the Council, which your sources lay out pretty clearly. 1, it no longer represents contemporary political reality.
Stuck in the past, basically.
2, its decisions seem to reflect mainly Western values and interests and are dominated by just a few powerful states. And 3, it lacks equitable representation. Not fair, not balanced.
Yeah, those critiques cut right to the heart of it, that the Council's design is fundamentally outdated, privileging the interests of a select few from a specific historical moment, 1945.
This pressure eventually led Secretary General Kofi Annan to start an inquiry back in 1997, and he explicitly asked, among other things, okay, if we add new members, permanent or non-permanent, how should we choose them?
Right. What should the criteria be?
And the sources list the criteria that were proposed at the time, things like being a major economic power, being a major military power, contributing substantially to the UN budget,
Money talk,
having a large population, respecting democracy and human rights, and representing the world's diversity, geographic, economic, cultural diversity.
Okay, just reading those criteria aloud. They sound reasonable on the surface, don't they?
They do, but your sources immediately point out the massive difficulties and the tricky questions each one raises. This is where it gets really tangled.
Yeah, the devil's in the details.
Like, how do you even define major military or economic power? Is there a clear threshold? Does a country get more, say, just because it writes bigger checks to the UN? Is that fair? Is a huge population an asset that deserves a seat, or maybe does it bring its own set of huge domestic challenges that might affect its global role? And can a country that always respects democracy and human rights be an effective player in the, let's face it, messy world of international security politics? That often means dealing with non-democratic states.
And this raises a really fundamental question. What are we actually trying to create here?
Yeah.
A council that reflects power as it exists today, or one based on values, or maybe demographics. And what happens when those things conflict?
Which they often do.
Exactly. Then there's the whole challenge of equitable representation. Okay, fine, but how do you slice that pie? By continent, by level of economic development, north versus south, by cultural grouping. I mean, defining diversity when every single nation is itself incredibly diverse. Just mind-bogglingly complex.
So just agreeing on the rules for who gets to be on the council is a minefield, because there's zero consensus on what criteria even matter most in the 21st century.
Precisely. It's not just about, drawing lines on a map. It's about these fundamentally different visions for what the council should be and who it should represent.
And tangled up in all of this, maybe the most contentious feature of all, the veto power.
Ah, the veto. Held exclusively by those 5 permanent members. The sources explain how it works. In the Security Council, any resolution needs 9 out of the 15 votes to pass. That's the basic rule.
Okay.
But crucially, if any one of the permanent 5, the U.S., Russia, China, UK, France, votes no, uses its veto, the decision is blocked, dead, even if all the other 14 members vote yes.
That's just immense power, isn't it? One country says no and it stops everything.
It is. It was originally put in there back in 1945, the thinking was, to ensure that the great powers of the day were all on board with major actions.
Made sense then, maybe?
Well, the idea was it would make the decisions stick and prevent the UN from doing things the most powerful states wouldn't support anyway, which might lead them to just ignore the UN or even leave, like what happened with the League of Nations.
Right.
But the source points out that today, there's incredibly strong demand to abolish the veto altogether, or at least modify it somehow. Many countries see it as totally undemocratic, contrary to the whole idea of sovereign equality among nations.
Which makes perfect sense logically. But the flip side, also highlighted in the material, is the harsh political reality. The P5, the permanent members, are highly unlikely to ever agree to give up their veto power. Why would they?
Exactly. And there's a credible argument, a real concern, that forcing them to might lead right back to that original fear. They might just disengage from the UN, walk away, rendering the body pretty toothless on major security issues.
Well, you're kind of stuck in this dilemma, aren't you? Keep the veto, and the council is seen as unrepresentative, maybe even paralyzed by the interests of just 5 states. Get rid of the veto, and you risk the most powerful states basically abandoning the system, potentially making the UN irrelevant when it comes to the most critical security matters. It's a really difficult balance, as the sources suggest.
A real catch-22. In some ways.
Feels like navigating between 2 bad options sometimes. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the second big area of reform. Not just the structure, but what issues the UN actually deals with. Its jurisdiction, its agenda.
Right. The material highlights the 60th anniversary meeting back in 2005 as a key moment. Member states actually agreed on some concrete steps then, trying to make the UN more relevant to the changing world.
Yeah, they took some real actions listed in the sources, created a peace-building commission, formally adopted the responsibility to protect Principle R2P.
That was a big one.
Established the Human Rights Council, agreed to the Millennium Development Goals for Global Development, explicitly condemned terrorism, set up a fund to promote democracy, and finally wound up the old Trusteeship Council, which was kind of obsolete.
But what's fascinating here, and it mirrors the structural reform debate, is that these expansions of the UN's agenda, these new roles, they're also incredibly contentious. The sources don't just list these achievements like bullet points. No, they immediately raise the hard questions, the difficulties around actually implementing these things. Okay, R2P sounds good, but which conflicts actually trigger it? Who decides what counts as a mass atrocity or a human rights violation severe enough to intervene? And who gets to do the intervening? Are these ambitious global goals like the SDGs actually realistic given all the national differences and competing interests? Can the world even agree on a single universal definition of terrorism? It's really hard.
And your notes use the example of the humanitarian crisis in Darfur in Sudan to show just how difficult it is to translate that lofty responsibility to protect principle into effective, unified action on the ground, especially when you're dealing with sovereign states and really complex internal conflicts.
Exactly. Saying you have a responsibility and actually acting on it effectively in the messy international system. Those are two very, very different things.
And the sources also point out that this whole world of international cooperation isn't just the UN, right?
Not all.
They mention other key players, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO for economic issues, the IAEA for nuclear matters, and important NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch doing advocacy work.
Right. It really emphasizes that the UN is just one piece, although arguably the central one, of a much larger, much more complex global governance puzzle. There's a whole ecosystem out there.
Okay, let's zoom in on how one specific major player, India, views all these UN reforms. What does the material say about India's position on this?
India's stance, according to the sources, is pretty clear and consistent. It strongly supports a revitalized, strengthened UN. They see it as essential for global peace and security.
Okay.
And they particularly want an enhanced UN focus on development issues.
And their core grievance.
Yeah.
That's their main complaint.
The sources say it's really that static composition of the Security Council. It hasn't fundamentally changed since, 1965, when they added a few non-permanent seats?
Right.
Despite the UN's membership nearly quadrupling since then, especially with all the developing countries joining after decolonization, India argues this makes the council totally unrepresentative.
And harms the voice of the developing world specifically.
That's their argument, yes.
Right.
It particularly disadvantages developing countries. So India advocates for increasing the membership of the Security Council, both permanent and non-permanent seats.
Why both?
They believe a larger, more inclusive council would be seen as more legitimate, and its decisions would carry greater weight, have more global support.
Makes sense. And India doesn't just want a reform, it wants in, right? Your sources detail India's arguments for why it deserves a permanent seat on that council.
They do. India points to several factors. Its massive population approaching 1/5 of all the people on Earth. Its status as the world's largest democracy. Its extensive participation in UN operations over the decades, especially peacekeeping missions. They're a major troop contributor.
Okay.
Its emerging economic power. And its consistent financial contributions to the organization, paying its dues.
So it ticks a lot of those boxes we talked about earlier.
It does seem to. And for India, gaining a permanent seat isn't just about raw power. The material suggests it's also deeply symbolic. It would reinforce its growing status on the global stage and significantly enhance its influence in shaping international foreign policy.
Okay, those sound like pretty strong arguments. But, as the sources quickly point out, India's ambition runs into some significant counterarguments, even resistance from other countries.
Absolutely. This raises that important question again. Even if a country meets some of the proposed criteria, are there other factors that come into play?
Like what?
Well, some countries express concern about India's, shall we say, troubled relationship with its neighbor, Pakistan. Could that dynamic complicate its role as a permanent member, supposedly responsible for global peace and security?
That's a tricky one.
There are also questions raised, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, about India's nuclear weapons capability.
Right, having nuclear weapons seems like it could be a factor, maybe a negative one, for a body that's meant to prevent conflict using them.
It's debated. And perhaps the biggest obstacle, the sources suggest, is this sort of contagion effect argument. If India gets a permanent seat, well then other major emerging powers would immediately intensify their own claims. Brazil, Germany, Japan, South Africa, the list goes on.
The G4 and others.
Exactly. And many countries, including some of the existing permanent members, oppose some or even all of those other candidates for their own various strategic or historical reasons.
Plus, there's that equitable representation argument cutting the other way. If the council expands, surely it must include permanent representation from continents that currently have none, like Africa and South America. You can't just add India or Germany or Japan and ignore whole continents.
Right. So as the sources conclude, Gaining a permanent seat is immensely difficult for India, or frankly, for any of the other main aspirants. It's precisely because of this tangled web of conflicting interests, strategic concerns, regional rivalries, and just fundamental disagreements over the criteria for membership in the first place.
It really sounds like a diplomatic Gordian knot, just impossible to untie easily. And all of these reform debates, they're happening in this world that was fundamentally changed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which left the U.S. as the sole superpower.
Which brings us to another key question your sources address. Can the UN actually serve as any kind of balance to U.S. dominance in this unipolar moment? Can it really constrain the U.S. from acting unilaterally whenever it wants?
And the answer from the material seems pretty stark, doesn't it? It's difficult, maybe even impossible, for the UN to truly balance U.S. power. Why? Because the U.S. just has overwhelming military and economic might.
Yeah.
And, frankly, the capacity to simply ignore the UN if it chooses to.
And furthermore, the U.S. isn't just powerful outside the UN, it has immense influence within the organization itself. It's the single largest financial contributor. The source gives that specific figure of 22%. For the 2019 regular budget, though it varies year to year.
That's a huge chunk.
It hosts the headquarters in New York. Many U.S. nationals work within the UN bureaucracy.
And of course, the veto power we keep coming back to.
Exactly. The U.S. can simply block any Security Council action it dislikes. The sources also mention U.S. influence in selecting the Secretary General and its ability to use its diplomatic and economic power to divide or split potential blocs of opposition among other nations on key votes.
So yeah, the sources conclude pretty clearly the UN is, quote, not therefore a great balance to the U.S.
Doesn't really function as a counterweight.
Okay, so if it can't really balance the superpower, is it just irrelevant in this context? Just a talking shop after all?
Well, what's fascinating here is the nuance the sources provide. They argue that even in this unipolar world, the UN serves a crucial, albeit maybe different, purpose. It acts as a vital forum, maybe the only truly global forum, that brings the U.S. and basically the rest of the world together.
Ah.
It's an arena where other countries, even if they can't directly block U.S. actions, can still voice their concerns. They can build coalitions for alternative approaches and potentially, maybe sometimes, influence or modify U.S. attitudes and policies through argument, diplomacy, and public pressure.
So it's less about being a physical check on power and more about providing that space for dialogue, maybe exerting some soft power, shaping compromises.
Exactly that. The sources note that even U.S. leaders, despite their occasional, sometimes very vocal frustrations with the UN, they continue to see its value. They still use it as a global forum for discussing issues with over 190 other nations. It's a place where the U.S. can build legitimacy for its actions when it chooses to work multilaterally. And it's where the rest of the world can collectively engage with, and maybe sometimes push back against, the dominant power. It keeps everyone talking, at least.
This deep dive has really clarified the picture painted by your sources. The UN is portrayed as this, well, deeply imperfect, often criticized institution, constantly struggling, it seems, to adapt its 1945 foundations to the realities and challenges of a vastly changed world.
Yeah, the material makes it very clear that the path to meaningful reform, whether we're talking about its structure or its agenda, is just incredibly complex. It's fraught with conflicting national interests and these really fundamental disagreements about what the UN should even be.
But the sources also offer this powerful counterpoint to all the criticism. Despite all its flaws, all the frustrations, the conclusion seems to be, without it, the world would be worse off.
That does seem to be the bottom line in much of the material.
And this increasing interdependence between nations, between global issues driven partly by technology, climate change, pandemics, it suggests the need for tools for global cooperation, and thus the importance of institutions like the UN is actually likely to grow, not shrink, even as they struggle so much to evolve.
It definitely presents a continuing challenge to all nations.
Okay.
How do you support and use these international organizations, leverage their potential while grappling with their inherent limitations? And how do you balance your own national self-interest with the needs of the broader international community? It's a constant balancing act.
So what does this all mean for you, listening, given how incredibly difficult it's proving to reform something as core as the Security Council, and the sheer complexity of defining the UN's role in tackling everything from pandemics to climate change in a world full of competing interests?
Yeah.
How likely is it really that the UN can adapt fast enough? Can it keep pace with the accelerating scale of future global challenges?
Mhm.
And perhaps more importantly, what role should you, the learner, the citizen, play in not just understanding these intricate global structures, but in thinking critically about how they should function in the future? Something to ponder, perhaps, as you continue your own exploration.